Freedom of speech is a concept that is often considered a pillar of democracy and a benchmark that is used to gauge the quality of life of citizens in countries all over the world. Currently in the United States, under the First Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, citizens are granted the rights of freedom of religion, speech, and press. However, the current system does not grant protected freedom of speech in situations and cases where there is defamation, threats, as well as cases of obscenity. If I could turn your attention to the visual that is attached to the submission page of this assignment, you will see a survey that was conducted through 2010 by Gallup, which posed the question to voters whether they thought the media in this country possessed freedom or not. So ranking in the top 10 of this poll were the Netherlands, Denmark, Australia, Sweden, Finland, Germany, the UK, Ireland, and New Zealand. As you can see, the United States did not fall into the top 10 of this poll, where voters thought that the media in this country possessed freedom. And this poses the question whether all forms of freedom of speech, whether all forms of freedom of speech should be protected or not. In my opinion, at this current time, with the growth of technology, social media, as well as the connectedness of people all over the world through the internet, not all forms of freedom of speech should be granted protection by the United States Constitution. Looking today at three cases, which are the Pentagon Papers case, Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, and the Brandenburg, and of examining the effectiveness of the Brandenburg test, I'll show the reasons why the current system that is in place works and why not all forms of freedom of speech should be protected. So the first case that we will look at today is the Pentagon Papers case. So the Pentagon Papers were a set of U.S. Department of Defense history of the U.S. political and military involvements in Vietnam from 1945 to 1967. So in 1971, these papers were somehow leaked and fell into the hands of a New York Times journalist by the name of Daniel Ellsberg. And in 1971, he published these papers on the front page of the New York Times. If I could again turn your attention to the visual that is attached to the assignment page of this assignment, I can show you. You will see the actual front page of the New York Times on that day in 1971, which read, "Vietnam Archive: Pentagon study traces 3 decades of growing U.S. involvement." So what really happened in this case were that papers which were classified and contained information which really revealed the scope and the scale of the U.S. involvement and placement during the Vietnam War, as well as maps which showed dissident activity and military engagements around Vietnam and surrounding areas such as Cambodia and Laos. These papers were leaked to the press in the form of being published on the front page of the New York Times. So obviously, many people were able to gain access to these classified documents. And this is an example where documents which not only put the United States national security and relationship with other countries in jeopardy, but it also put in danger the lives of soldiers who were in the war, as well as those who were stationed after the war, that were there to help Vietnam integrate its country back together and integrate themselves back into the global community. So this is really a case where not all freedom of speech should be protected, as we saw by President Nixon. Claiming his executive authority to force the New York Times to suspend publication of this document and publication of the paper on this day. This is a case where we can really see that complete freedom of press can not only cause harm to the overall utility of the American people, but American soldiers who were physically stationed in wars abroad in Vietnam or in present day in the Middle East. The second case that will be looked at today is the Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project case. In this case, the U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder barred the Humanitarian Law Project from providing any sort of training to the Kurdistan Workers' Party. So the Kurdistan Workers' Party was a militant nationalist party that was considered a terrorist cell that operated in Sri Lanka and Turkey, and the Humanitarian Law Project aimed to train the Kurdistan Workers' Party in peace negotiations. Although they did have altruistic intentions, it is clear that it was clear, as was found by U.S. Attorney General Eric Holder, that negotiations with the Kurdistan Workers' Party would have legitimized the group and freed up their resources by showing that they were a legitimate group that had support of an organization in the Western world. So again, this is another case where, another harsh case where a group that had altruistic intentions, the Humanitarian Law Project, who were hoping to teach peace negotiations to a group called the Kurdistan Workers' Party, although they had altruistic intentions, a precedent would be set if the U.S. legal system found that the Humanitarian Law Project should be allowed to interact and provide training to the Kurdistan Workers' Party. So this is another case where freedom of speech should not have been protected, as this would have set a precedent where any sort of organization which feigned the purpose of humanitarian acts onto a terrorist group could have interacted and trained those terrorist groups, and really once these groups got in contact with a group such as the Kurdistan Workers' Party, no one really knows what information could have been passed along and what resources could have been passed along. So really, this is a case again where freedom of speech should not have been protected, as not only would it have set a precedent for future cases, but it also would have there would also be a situation where a terrorist cell would have been legitimized. So the third case of evidence we will look at today is examining the effectiveness of the Brandenburg test, which is a test that is used to define clear and present danger by determining when inflammatory speech intending to advocate illegal action can be restricted. So the standard was developed and determined that speech advocating the use of force or crime could only be prescribed where two conditions were satisfied. And the first was that the advocacy is directed to inciting or producing imminent lawless action, and the second was the advocacy is also likely to incite or produce such action. So actually, the first time the Brandenburg test has been used hundreds of times in the U.S. legal system, but the first time that a case passed the Brandenburg test, and therefore freedom of speech was shut down, was in the Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project case. As all the components of the case passed this test, it was found that freedom of speech was not upheld by the U.S. Constitution. So the Brandenburg test, whose components I just outlined for you, and reasons for existing I just outlined for you, have been used numerous times since 1987, and really has only passed a few times, which shows that freedom of speech is allowed to exist in many forms, many times throughout the years. But there are certain cases where it should not be protected. Of course, advocates of freedom of speech can always cite the Constitution as a backbone to their argument, but the Constitution is there to protect the United States and its citizens, and complete freedom of speech in this modern time would not be contributing towards this. The protection of all forms of freedom of speech is a utopian ideal that cannot be achieved for the United States without giving up the possibility of our safety as well as our security. So really, looking at the three cases of the Pentagon Papers case, Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project, as well as showing how the Brandenburg test is fair and allowing most forms of freedom of speech to be passed, but in those cases where freedom of speech should not be protected, the Brandenburg test really shuts it down. Using these three cases as an example of why freedom of speech should not have complete freedom, I hope you can see that that is in the best interest of the United States, as well as our national security and our citizens, if not all forms of freedom of speech are protected at all times.